Here we go. So thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar. The Tug Hill Commission is excited to bring you this fun and historical 3-part webinar series about logging on Tug Hill. This unique piece of history comes to us from a Tug Hill family and their cherished documents, letters, photographs, and artifacts passed down through generations and recounted and interpreted for us by our very own Leona Chereshnoski and her son Peter. First, a couple of housekeeping items. You're all muted and have your videos off to reduce the load on the internet. So please put your questions and comments in the chat box. Second, the webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly after tonight through our website and YouTube channel. So now let me tell you a little bit about our speakers before I hand it over to them. Leona Clemons was born and raised on a small farm in Osceola, New York, where she attended the one-room schoolhouse in the hamlet. Later, she attended junior high and high school in Camden. She and her husband, Ray, raised 3 children in the town of Lorraine, where she worked as a library clerk. After that, she attended Empire State College and Syracuse University, where she earned her master's degree in library science. She worked as a library clerk and school librarian in the South Jeff schools for 27 years before retiring in 2006. She now works part-time as the director of the Osceola Public Library, and her family owns and operates a B&B on the family farm. She is an active volunteer and, in full disclosure, is a 36-year veteran commissioner on the Tug Hill Commission. Peter Chereshnoski made his early trips around the sun on the northwestern slope of Tug Hill in the town of Lorraine on the weekdays. And on the weekends, he could be found on the southwestern slope of Tug Hill in the town of Osceola. And a good share of the rest of his days have been spent driving back and forth between the two. After high school came college, followed by 4 years on the USS Atlanta, which was a fast attack submarine stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. Peter came back to Tug Hill and worked with his father, Ray, in his logging business for some time before landing a position at the regional landfill. And 28 years later, he continues to work for the Development Authority of the North Country as the safety and environmental coordinator. Peter's interests and hobbies revolve around nature and the outdoors. He and his wife, Mary, enjoy walks in the Gulfs near their home in Rodman, kayaking and learning about the world around them. And now, without further ado, here's what we've been waiting for. Here's Peter and Leona. Okay.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming listening.
For many years, the scrapbooks of my grandfather, John Clemons, called Old Lard, have been brought out of the chest only briefly, perhaps for verification of some tidbit of family history or confirmation of some item of importance about Tug Hill's distant past. They have been shared at annual Clemens family reunion, which has continued since 1918, when grandfather's cousin, Clarence Durst, was leaving for service in World War I. As a lifelong resident of Osceola, a small town on Tug Hill's southern rim, Old Lard worked all his life logging in the area. The books contain newspaper clippings, unusual advertising copy of years gone by, photographs of family members or complete strangers, and other memorabilia. The treasure, though, is the cache of letters Grandpa wrote to the Deacon Doubleday, and then a then popular early morning Syracuse radio announcer. Each page-long letter told some tale of Tug Hill Woods or some character who could be found there. In the slang of the woods, using comical nicknames and with a flavor all his own, Grandpa spun the yarns for about 10 years. The records we worked from are sometimes old blue carbon copy of yesterday, carefully typed by his daughter-in-law, my mother, Alice Clemens of Osceola, who worked up the manuscripts from his draft copies, jotted down on various paper scraps, envelopes, or as he spoke. The turn of the words are his own, and the phrases, comparisons are just as he gave them to her. His limited education showed plainly in his spelling and grammar, and there have been corrections on those. But the substance of his tales are his actual stories, and for us, a treasure. Some of the things he wrote about, I can remember him recounting, for as old timers do, he reminisced a good deal about the old days to anyone who would listen. His sense of humor is easily spotted in his work and is one of the traits best remembered about Grandpa. Born in 1886, one of 13 children of Leona and George Washington Clemons, Old Lard was schooled to 4th grade at the one-room schoolhouse down the road from the family farm. District number 4, Maple Grove School. He went to work in the woods at a young age and survived a ruptured appendix at age 16. It was to be the first of many medical problems he experienced throughout his 75 years. In 1906, he married my grandmother, Esther Rowell, and they raised 6 children, of whom my father, Irwin Jiggs Clemens, was the 4th. The John Clemonses celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1956, and after those long years together, they died nearly together. He in December of 1961, and she in January of 1962. These scrapbooks are credited to Grandpa, but I must acknowledge that it was more than likely my grandmother who put them together. There are mementos in the book that my grandfather must have saved from childhood, such as a small, beautiful braid of his sister's hair and family photographs, but I can see her touch in the collection of his materials. Behind us, perhaps you can see the Clemens family records that have been passed on down the generations.
So the first letter we're going to hear is how Old Lard received his nickname. Dear Sirs, I enjoyed the last issue of Camp News, as it seemed there was much more news in it than in the past. But being an old logger, I have a good many gripes about educated lumberjacks. I will go back some 40 years and tell how I got the nickname of Old Lard. Tom Leonard of Taberg had just graduated from Camden High School at the age of 17, and in camp, he was called the high school logger. He was skidding spruce 16 feet long, and making my rounds through the woods on the next ridge, I saw the horse get down and lift 3 times. As I loved horses, I knew that something was wrong and got to him quick, and was mad when I saw that he was hooked in the middle of a 16-inch, 16-foot log with a stump at each end. I said, "You little white hope, don't you know enough to hook one end or the other?" He replied, "You fat, greasy old lard." Well, we'll skip that word. Drive that horse yourself. He went a little ways and came back and said, I ought to know better than that, and picked up the lines and went on skidding. I have not changed my mind about the educated lumberjack. He is just a little white hope. I would like to take this class of forester in the woods that I cut off 40 years ago. I know that there has not been any foxes in the woods on this 200 acres, and it seems foolish to me to think that anybody can think of taking over God Almighty's job successfully. Reforesting our cleared land is good. I would next like to take you to where the babes in the woods girdled the trees. Took nature's job away from nature, and the winds of 1951 finished what was left. Out of all the jackers that I have known on Tug Hill, I have yet to see the first one that quit the woods and got all their old machines sold off and had anything to show for it in 5 years. And I have yet to see the first forester venture into the logging business. The laying out of woods roads is not in book form, and I have yet to see any of them step up to a tree with a 2-faced axe and chop it down. When they try it, they make me think they are counterfeit porcupines. I am interested in your log scale article. As I see it, I think that the Doyle scale is the fairest, if used as the instructions tell you. Yours truly, Old Lard. So it appears my great-grandfather was a gruff old jobber. I think as we grow older, sometimes we forget how we learned the things we learned. I think we learn life by living it. Young Tom Leonard learned something that day in the woods. I wonder if old Lard did too. It might be he learned, on that day at least, that he was an old Lard. Old Lard embraced his nickname, so much so that the nameplate on his mailbox read, Old Lard Clemons. This next letter picks up on an industry that had its beginnings in Maine in the 1800s.
The gum pickers. On December 15th, 1881, the Journal and Republican of Lowville noted, there is no doubt a large amount of spruce gum in the forest of Lewis County that could be gathered and placed upon the market. The gum business is booming, and many a poor family living in the neighborhood of our forest can gather that article during the present winter and make some good wages. The Copenhagen column of the January 6, 1881 Lowville Times announced, bring on your spruce gum to the farmer's store. The April 4th, 1881 Watertown Times reported that Henry Snook returned Saturday evening from gum country where he had been spending a few weeks. He had been passing out spruce gums to all his friends and says, the people up there grow small potatoes on purpose to shoot the gum off the trees. The popularity of spruce gum began after settlers learned from Native Americans that the resin produced by the spruce tree had several uses. Native Americans used it for medicinal purposes such as skin irritation and sores, and it was used as a sealant for canoes and for chewing. By the mid-1800s, a number of Maine companies made spruce gum cough syrup and advertised chewing gum, spruce gum, as an aid to digestion. This in turn made the spruce on Tug Hill and the gum it produced a valuable commodity. This letter from old Lard, dated on March 3rd, 1938, tells of the forest, the gum pickers, and their tools on the year he was born. The story of Tug Hill and the production of spruce gum for which it is known has been related to me innumerably by my parents, sisters, and brothers. The story goes on that about the time of my birth, 52 years ago, a blight descended upon the spruce forest, causing the trees to die. This blight was characterized by the opening of seams in the trees, by the falling of the branches and the seeping through the openings and cracks, the pure spruce gum. Men of the community, numbering hundreds, would then enter the woods, oftentimes a distance of more than 6 miles. Their aim was to excavate a pit about 5 or 6 feet deep at the base of a tree and place long poles leaning against the tree, which were then covered with evergreen boughs, balsam, or spruce were preferred. A bed that would then be built within the pit, again using balsam or spruce boughs. A fire would be started in the pit, keeping the camp warm and comfortable. From the camp, the men would travel, returning at night by way of snowshoes, a distance of more than 3 miles, seeking the gum. Weekly trips back to the clearings were made where the gum was delivered to the wives of the workers. Their duty was to clean the gum, a process accomplished by scraping the gum with the top of butter tubs. The gum was ready for market. A price of about 50 cents a pound was realized at local markets, although a higher price could be obtained by shipping the product to Boston or New York markets. The tool used in the gathering of gum, though, was quite a complicated arrangement. It was homemade. It consisted of 2 poles, either square or rounded, of about 12 feet in length, to which one end was attached a tin can. On one side of the stick, an old file, properly shaped by a blacksmith, was riveted to be used as a spud. Around the top of the tin can, the blade part of the side was riveted. The other pole was fixed with a ferrule about the top. The top pole would fit in this arrangement and could be used in one or two sections. The square poles were made with the same sort of cup, but by the use of a thumb screw, could be adjusted to various lengths. The date of my birth, March 3rd, 1886, was preceded by a heavy snowfall of about 3 foot in depth. My father was located at what was called 6 Mile Camp. The trees were covered with snow of at least 6 inches depth. Due to the weather, the gum pickers had started to break camp and tried to make the clearings. 10 men were on the snowshoe trail, with one acting as a leader. The leader would travel a short distance, step aside, and allow the next man to lead. By this system of changing leaders, the leader would eventually be the last man on the trail. Each man carried a load of at least 75 pounds of gum. As my father approached our home, so the story goes, he was informed by an old lady of the birth of a child to his wife, without the care and attention of a physician. The latest arrival increased the number of children in the family to 12. Back in those days, it was quite a difficult matter to obtain the services of a doctor, since the nearest one was located 20 miles distant, and horses were the only means of travel. Our hardship was increased by the fact that father was trying to complete a frame house, which he had been building for his family, with the assistance of his 16-year-old son. We had moved from our log house to the frame house nearly 2 years before, even though the new home was not fully completed. To construct a house, pay for the farm, and maintain a family of 14, quite a bit of effort was required. However, I never experienced hunger unless it was for punishment, and I was denied my supper and sent to bed. During the summer, the Tug Hill men would contract with the tanneries at Redfield. Men from Florence and Osceola also joined the movement. Hemlock in abundance could be found on the hill. There were trees that would be felled and at 4-foot lengths. The tree would be cut through the bark. Sputters were then used to remove the bark, which was allowed to dry flesh side up for a day. It was then put into hand piles where it was allowed to dry. Early in August, with a boat, teams of horses or oxen, it was placed in large piles to wait winter when it was hauled to market. Often we hear today the talk of the waste of trees cut in this manner. The trees were valueless for lumber, and many times the trees were so shaky at the stump that boards made from them would fall to pieces. By removing the diseased trees and converting the sap derived therefrom into a valuable product, the sun was able to penetrate the forest, strengthen the trees, and as a result, the spruce and hemlock of today are valuable timber. I am proud to claim Tug Hill as my birthplace. Very truly yours, Old Lard. The climbing spikes pictured here may have been used to climb the tree to collect gum. These tools are in Old Lard's barn, along with other tools and gadgets that Old Lard owned. The boat he refers to, hauling the hemlock bark, was most certainly a stone boat. They were used to haul stones and almost anything that needed to be moved around the property.
So in that letter, 6 Mile Camp, where Old Lard's father was picking gum, was likely on 6 Mile Creek, off the old Martinsburg Trail. Going northeast from North Osceola, there's 1 Mile Creek, 2 Mile Creek, 3 Mile Creek, up to 6 Mile Creek, and they're all about a mile apart. So the creek, the headwaters of 6 Mile Creek begin in Monteola and run south into Fish Creek. Next story Mom's going to read is the beginning of the Woods Enterprise in North Osceola.
May 19th, 1949, Grandpa writes, in the year 1892, a young man, Edgar Durst, came to our home to board, and the plans were laid for building a new steam sawmill on the only place I ever knew of growing hops in this part of the country. There was a barn, an old log house, and a hop kiln. The kiln was to be used for a house. The mill was to be 40 by 8 feet. I was 8 years old and lived only 1 mile away, but I had never been there. It was just a vision to me. Along in July, I heard them talking of a wedding. And on the 26th of July, they put up spruce boughs and flowers and trimmings up in the parlor. And the door between the dining room and the parlor had more of these trimmings. After a while, it got soaked into my head that my sister Louise was going to marry Elmer Durst, Edgar's brother. The new business was to be the Durst Brothers sawmill. The 27th came, a beautiful day, and people began to come. By 2 o'clock, people were everywhere, but the majority were crowded into the house someplace. My sister Marcia and I were sitting on the right-hand side of the parlor on a stool not too far from the arch, eyes and ears open, not knowing what it was all about. The sawmill was moved in, and by the 1st of September was sawing lumber, the first of the logging in these parts. Soon there were 7 mills between there and Redfield, a distance of 5 miles. Being steam, the Durst Brothers mill was the fastest and best and gave work to all the families in these parts. This made snowshoe tracks over to roads that you could drive horses on in the winter. The mill did custom sawing and owned a timber tract of 700 acres, all virgin, soft, and hardwood. The softwood was sold locally, and the hardwood went to broom handles and was shipped to Amsterdam. My dad went to getting out piano rails, but there seemed to be no market for the beech. As the industry grew, Dad got an order for bicycle rims from C.F. Stearns Bicycle Company of Syracuse. I was 12 years old that summer. During vacation, all country boys have to have a job. My dad said that if you did not have a job, the devil would find one for you. I was working at the cutoff saw one day, and my brother Clarence was ripping out the straps. I saw him reach down to soak the feed belt to keep it from slipping. As he straightened up, he called, "Father, see what I have done." He'd cut off all the fingers on his right hand. It was the first accident I had ever witnessed. Hard luck could not stop, and the next trouble was the mill burned that fall. Durst had a big stock of logs at their plant and no mill. Spring came, they had purchased another bigger mill and had a sale for all the broom handles. Stedmans lived across the lot and had a large house, camp, and sawmill. And in all, there were 11 families in sight of one another. Logging was growing strong. It is a sight today. All that is left is the big Durst house. Where the big Stedman house was, now there is a camp. It's just a ghost town. As the hamlet was thriving in the forest, the city slickers had their eyes on us. The first I remember of the pack was the pack peddlers with a box of jewelry and a telescope suitcase. Little old men carried them on their back. Even the best lumberjacks could hardly pick them off the ground. I have been told of several spots where they were robbed, and one spot in Redfield where one was killed. They would visit the camp on a Saturday and Sunday. Everyone bought some of their goods, which made a good business for the peddlers. The first horse and cart peddler was Myers Winkelstein of Syracuse, who had a big supply of suits, work shirts, and all kinds of wear, but the jewelry box was never forgotten. Possibly $50 would have bought all his watches, rings, pins, and glasses you could fix yourself up with. The next one was Eli Goldman of Rome. He had a horse and cart and good suits. And if he did not have it, he would bring you whatever you wanted the next time. His goods were of good quality and he was a good salesman. And there were about 50 men working for him and the hotel in Redfield. He was due here every 4 weeks. His 2 sons have just visited us, and they are pretty good salesmen, but their father could talk all around them. Their names were Arthur Goldman of Syracuse and Harold Goldman of Utica. Max Rosenberg of Syracuse was another fine fellow. I would like to see him again. And then there was Sam Simpkins of Rome, who now has a big dry goods store there. He was 16 years old then. He stood up in the front of his cart and swung that whip. There was never a dull weekend. The eats were always good. And if you don't believe it, ask the head of the C.E. Mills Oil Company of Syracuse. He was around then, and he'll tell you that hospitality and eats in this neck of the woods could never be forgotten. I'll hear you in the morning, old Lard.
That letter amused me. At the beginning of the letter, he talks about living a mile away from the site of the Durst sawmill, and at 8 years old, having never seen it. It's hard for me to comprehend never seeing something that short a distance away. At that age, my friends and I spent the summer roaming the foothills of the Tug. Occasionally, the devil found jobs for us, as old Lard's father would say.
There were at least 2 mills in Osceola that made broom handles. The Durst mill on the north end of town, that's what we call Peaky, the north end of town. And the Clemens mill on the Clemens Road is the site of the current North American Fiddlers Hall of Fame. And what you see is a label from the broom factory at the Clemens mill on Clemens Road.
The 19th century brought change off the hill as well. The first paper mills were using old cloth rags and linens to make their products. There were cloth peddlers that would go door to door and collect cloth, and cloth dealers that would buy the cloth and sell to the paper makers.
I remember in the 40s growing up, a man would come to the house about twice a year, and in the walkway to the outhouse was a burlap bag. We always put our discarded cloth in the bag. When the man came, we would give him the cloth. I never knew where the cloth went, and I don't believe we were ever paid for it.
Off the north end of the Tug Hill, the Black River was harnessed for industry in and around Watertown. Paper-making innovations were quickly adopted in Watertown, including the pulp grinders and fourdrinier machines that provided for the large continuous sheets of paper. And finally, the sulfite process, which produced wood pulp that was almost pure cellulose fibers. All this was done by 1867. Then, in 1894, G.H.P. Gould built the pulp and paper mill at Lyons Falls. The technology being used in the mills around the hill became very efficient. The poplar trees were all used up, and the easy-to-get spruce was gone as well.
In this next letter, dated August 12th, 1949, to the Deacon, old Lard talks about the end of the spruce gum heyday and how the harvest of the old growth forest began in earnest.
Tracks, trails, and rails. Dear Bob, from 1896 to 1900, the gum picking was getting scarcer. The overage trees had all died off, and the younger ones were growing fast. As you stood on a high elevation of land and looked off at the forest, you would see these old trees with no branches. They are spoken of as rampiles. The name is still used around the woods today. Monroe Manchester, an old gum picker and woodsman, as he was then called, we had no men with the title forester back then. He roamed the forest and looked after lot lines on the tract of land spoken of as the Bicknell Tract. It consisted of 45,000 acres in the middle of the woods in the townships of Osceola and Haymarket. He painted his lot corners with red paint. Today, the foresters paint their lot lines with yellow paint. I only know of one corner that shows the red paint now. Different companies would come in, look the tract over, and call it too much of a job to get the timber off. They all agreed that if there were only a way to getting a railroad up those hills. But the elevation in the highest place was 2,100 feet. It turned all landlookers back, but the Dexter Sulfite Company, they could not give up. They came on the west end of the hill to Monroe for his advice. But Mad River was there, and they did not want to bring the timber this way if they could get a road to the east, as Gould Paper Company would help to build the road to Osceola town line. Monroe told them there was one place they could get off the hill to the east. The hill was so steep from Houseville to Glenfield that they would have to figure that out for themselves. Monroe's secret passage was at a ledge of rock that a small creek run through. His ancestors being Indians, he had kept it to himself. The company was willing to make him happy if he would show them his secret. They'd give him a job for life. He took them down the creek. The station at that point was called Gulf Head on the tickets. The brook ran about 20 feet below the tracks, and the ledge of rock that stood above the tracks was from 50 to 100 feet high. It was early spring of 1900. The survey was made, and during the summer, the work began. The grading of the road was a slow process. The wages were $1.75 a day for the best men. This was the first blasting I'd ever heard. Everyone was scared to even look at the tools they were used to make a blast.
The road was,
Lost it.
the road was completed. Right here, the road was.
The road was completed to 22, page on the map now, in the fall of 1901. Dexter Sulfite Company had bought all that tract of land owned by Page and Fairchild and the 45,000 acres that Monroe Manchester looked after. The company then found that they did not need Manchester's services. Discouraged, he went back to Mad River, sold his little place to Blount Lumber Company for a clubhouse. He and his two sons went west to the state of Oregon and bought a tract of timber. He was successful, and at his recent death, had enough of earthly goods to make some of the biggest lumber firms look cheap. Hear you in the morning, Old Lard. P.S. I'm glad to accept the nomination of the Conservation Commissioner, and if elected, I will have a cleaning out of those birds who try to run nature's business and take full control of the supreme powers that has been so successful for ages. I think that I would put the babes in the woods to work with DDT and spray those worm nests that are getting ready to kill all the wild black cherries that make feed for our partridge. I would replace the logs in the trout streams that have rotted away as they hold back water. Tell the big guys in Albany that they make me think of a ditty I learned in Sunday school. It went like this. The lightning bug is brilliant, but he hasn't any mind. He stumbles through existence with his headlight on behind.
My grandfather had quite a sense of humor, which appears in some of these letters. His nomination as conservation commissioner was one. What he did not know was what DDT would do to the environment. He spoke in a letter about coming up with a plane load of bug dust, of bug death, and taking logs back with them. I can tell what was supposed to be funny, remembering Grandpa's ways. My son never knew him, so he isn't always sure whether to take things seriously or not.
His reference to 22 was what he called in other letters, Old 22, which apparently is the same place as Page. I suspected and understand now that the reference to 22 was Great Lot number 22, in which Page is located.
Redfield, New York, July 29th, 1949. Dear Bob, Tug Hill is made up of so many tracts of land, and when they speak of Tug Hill today, it is made up of lands from the town of Osceola, Lewis, High Market, Montague in Lewis County, and the town of Redfield in Oswego County. Originally in the 80s, it was that portion of land that the elevation was 1,600 to 1,700 feet, and in any direction was downhill to get to any of the above towns mentioned. At the time, the old timers would talk that it was so rough that it would never be lumbered off. Several different ones would try it, and all wound up with no money. And as the old saying goes, they would come in on velvet and go out by the seat of their pants. The White tract of 22,000 acres was owned by Hugh and Pierpont White and looked after by Henry Hilton. The tract began near Osceola and went north to the old Michigan Mills tract. The owners came from Michigan and built a mill that would saw about 25,000 feet a day. They only operated a short time. The name of this company was Hood and Gale. They sold their land of 15,000 acres to Page and Fairchilds of Oswego, who were connected to the shade cloth of Minetto. Mr. Starks was superintendent, and his son-in-law, Mr. Loomis, was the bookkeeper, postmaster, and storekeeper. They had a schoolhouse, a blacksmith shop, and Mike Dempsey built a shack just off the company land and ran a booze joint. The dirtiest place I ever ate a piece of Limburger cheese. This mill was known in 1903 as Page. There were 4 million feet of lumber piled up, and they built a tram road 6 miles and had to deliver this lumber to where it could be drawn to market. The tram was constructed of plank, laid crossways like ties, close enough so that the horses would not step through between them. A 4x4 was on top of for a car to run on, drawing about 20,000 feet to a load. There were 50 teams, and the lumber was drawed all that fall. Harold Durkee visited me on the 24th, and he told me of the people that listened to you in Ilion. He left about 4 p.m. Harold Morrison and his family came and wanted to take Esther and I for a ride. They thought to go to Boonville and down to Rome and home would make a nice ride, but not for me. Like a lot of people, I like to go back and see how the things have changed in 50 years. To drive through the woods up to that old Goodhines Road past Fish Creek Church. We got off on the wrong road as I wanted to see old people that had said and meant, give us this day our daily bread. And there were no strikes. And people were happy clearing off the thousands of acres that are now growing up to brush. I found Gerald and Donald Shue that told me of the right road. I found a man by the name of Anthony Dillenbeck, 80 years old, who told us a lot about Page. We had a nice visit with Ormsby Rutledge, the old-time fiddler, who has taken several prizes on several programs. His picture was in the Lowville paper last week, and he was very much pleased. He was born 5 miles from Page and on farmland now growing up to brush. Excuse me. 2 miles from there, in an old abandoned schoolhouse, we saw a man near the road with hair as white as snow and his face looking familiar. I said, "What's your name?" He answered, "What difference does it make to you what my name is?" He came nearer to the road and said, "Powell." I reached out and said, "Hello, Lee." He looked me all over and he said, "John Clemons, you look just like your father." He taught school in my home district, number 4 in Osceola in 1901. He made a success of life teaching school on Long Island. He has built several houses and now has retired. You can't take the woods away from a lot of us. He lives in the schoolhouse that he taught in for his summer home. For 5 miles from Old Page, it's just woods again. On the way back, we stopped at the old Prussian settlement picnic grounds. We saw Mr. Trainer, our school superintendent for so many years, and we're sorry for him with all his affliction, the loss of his wife and a broken leg. But when the clouds are so very dark, one can look about and see someone with a heavier load. Hear you in the morning, old Lard.
When I was a kid, my parents used to often take us for Sunday drives. The story starts off with old Lard and the missus going for a drive with their daughter and her husband. Those were simpler times when a good thing to do was drive around the back roads and see what there was to see. Maybe we'll all get to that again someday. We want to thank the Tug Hill Commission for helping us share these letters, share these letters with you that have been a part of our family's life for so long. We look forward to sharing more letters with you in the next session in February, where we will read letters about both hardship and humor. So join us and find out what happens to snow on Tug Hill at the end of winter.
Terrific. Wow, thanks, guys. Listen, I want to go back, if it's okay with you, Peter. I believe I missed a slide of yours where you were talking about North Osceola. Do you want to go back and explain any of that, or should we go back there?
It's up to you. I'm fine with that if you want to.
Let's see if, first of all, let's see if we have any questions. We're getting a lot of compliments. Yeah, the firefly joke. If you have any questions, please let us know. Let me share this again. Let me get back to where that first map was. I had quite a delay in when I was trying to advance the slides some, so go back here.
So here's a question for you while you're finding that, Jen. Somebody wants you to say again, Leona and Pete, what the spruce gum was used for.
Okay, it was, I always heard that it was sold as a pharmaceutical or lacquer products. Any spruce gum I've ever tasted, it wouldn't be used for chewing a whole lot, but apparently a lot of people did. I guess maybe if they didn't have Wrigley's, they might have chewed spruce gum. Somewhere. Here it is.
The Native Americans used it, talked about using it for sores on their skin, and so if you've ever grabbed onto a spruce tree going through the woods that had sap on it, you could understand why they would, because it's just like a Band-Aid. And since those days, they've determined that spruce gum actually has antibacterial properties, So that was one of the things the Indians used it for. But they're, like Mom says, they made lacquer products out of it. What was some of the other things we did?
Cough syrup, that company.
Yeah, there
cough
were
syrup,
several companies in
chewing.
Maine that really made spruce gum popular, and they made it into everything they could think of that might sell. But
So we
main
have a
thing
couple, oh,
was,
go ahead.
was chewing it. Go ahead.
Couple other questions. Someone wants to know, where is Amsterdam, the location of the broom makers? Not sure.
I think that's down towards the city.
Yeah. Well, it's on the Hudson, isn't it?
I think so.
Amsterdam, as you're driving to Albany, you see it on the thruway?
Yep.
Okay.
I
Another
don't know.
question is,
Like
I
after-
love, another question is, I love the saying, "Hear you in the morning." Is there any meaning behind that?
Just that he'd be there to hear him in the morning.
So the Deacon had a radio show in Syracuse, and old Lard would listen to him every morning. So that was his goodbye was hear you in the morning. He's going to have the radio on in the morning.
Nice. Can you repeat the name of the railroad,
That was the Glenfield and Western.
or known as the G&W, right?
Yeah. Gee Whiz was another nickname for it.
Yep. Yep, so was the railroad named the Glenfield and Western? Yep, that's right. Let's see if we have any other questions. Another question, did the old timers consider the town of Worth part of the Tug Hill back in the early 1900s?
So if you could bring up that map for me, Angie. So the purple line, the jagged kind of line going all the way around, that's the 1600 contour line. And so the old timers considered everything inside that was Tug Hill, but everything outside wasn't considered Tug Hill. So Worth Center's on the top left of that. Yep. That would have been part of Worth would have been in the 1600, and part of it would have been out. So part of Worth was, yes.
Thank you.
And someone's got a question. The G&W, I believe she's referring to, is that the same railroad that came to Redfield, the one that came up from Williamstown? I think it's a different railroad.
That's a different railroad.
Different.
Yes, it was. The Comstock family is the one that was involved in the one coming from Williamstown to Redfield.
I was just reading a comment from Jerry Ritter who said she can remember her father giving them spruce gum, and her sister had asthma and was supposed to help clean out her lungs. And yeah, interesting.
It does have that, whatever, I'm not sure if it's menthol or what flavor to it. I've tried it, and it's kind of hard to get off your teeth. So I didn't go back for more.
Yeah, I tried it once too. It didn't last long for me.
Tom Voss wants to say the Amsterdam Broom Company was established on Lower Brookside Ave by Julius Wasserman in 1884. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very
The
much.
internet, great.
I know. Ellen says, where was the homestead located?
On North Osceola Road. I guess not even halfway across, about a quarter of a mile from the corner where the Martinsburg Trail would have started.
You'll have to listen to our future ones. We're going to have more on. We'll have some close-up maps in North Osceola, show you where the homestead was, that kind of thing.
We should note that the next installment of Letters from a Tug Hill Logger Part 2 is February 24th, Wednesday night, same time.
I like the comment from Robert. The men in those days make us look like real wimps. I think I would only last about 2 hours in some of those situations.
Yeah, I often thought going through the letter where he talks about swinging a two-faced axe, and I said I probably would qualify as a counterfeit porcupine myself. So
put the link to register for the next webinar there if you wanted to get a jump on the next one. The thing that struck me was toward the beginning of your presentation when old Lard talked about removing the disease trees and converting the sap derived there. The sun was able to penetrate the forest and strengthen the trees. As a result, the spruce and hemlock of today are valuable timber. I mean, that's like, that was I think that's what I remember my silviculture course in college. So it was really striking to me to hear that. So pretty cool.
Yeah, the hemlock still gets some shake. The older the trees get, the more shake they'll have. If you're cutting hemlock for lumber these days, it's actually better to take some of the smaller trees because the bigger trees will have the shake.
Gotcha. Question from Irene: was the Quinn Dairy Farm in Osceola the only one, or were there other dairy farms on the hill?
I think most every family had a farm. I think because every place you see always had a barn. And so I think it was more like subsistence farming. They would at least keep enough cattle to provide for their families and maybe to have some butter to sell. That kind of thing. It was a big industry, was just the butter and cheese. I don't ever hear much about cheese. Grandpa never said anything much about cheese factory, but I know here in Lorain that there was a lot of cheese. Almost every corner, I think there was a cheese factory, but they're all gone now.
In a lot of old Lard's letters, so the Deacon Doubleday radio show was an agriculture radio show, and that's why old Lard listened to it, because he had cows, and so he always followed the agriculture magazines that they put out in those days. And he would, in some of his letters, he would talk about how much whatever barley was raised in Osceola or whatever. So maybe we'll work that into some of the future ones so that you can get an idea of what was going on with agriculture in Osceola in the early days.
Tom wants to know more about the shake in the hemlock, the shake you're referring to.
So basically what happens in hemlocks as they age is in the growth rings. I'm not sure if it's just a disease or whether it's old age, but if you saw a hemlock log, where those growth rings are, that the wood will split away there. It won't stay together like pine will. And so that's what shake is. And you can have a perfectly good tree and have half looks fine on the outside, but on the inside, those rings will be failing, I guess. And when you saw it, they'll fall right apart.
Interesting.
Bob Sauer could probably tell us more about it.
Probably.
Where are you, Bob? Let's see if we can find him.
Bob, if you have a microphone, I just allowed you to talk.
Well, thanks, Katie.
Or not.
Oh, there he is.
Can you hear me? Well, anyways, the shake is a separation of the growth rings in the interior of the old growth hemlock. And as was mentioned, the older the tree, the more likely you're going to get shake. And the shake is obviously, when you saw that into boards or try to, it'll just shake apart, really. I mean, I think that's where the term comes from, shake. It's just like each year there's layer of growth. And when the shake occurs through aging, I think I'm getting it right now. No, but when the shake occurs, the growth rings on the interior of the tree just separate almost like sheets of paper, but not. It's fragile. So it's not usable for lumber, and I don't think for pulp manufactured paper. So that's what little bit I know about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Another question, was the hemlock also used for tanning hides?
That's what they were doing by taking the bark from the hemlock. That's what the what were the mills called? Tanneries. They would get that sap off the bark, out of the bark, and that was used for tanning hides. Tanneries were down in Redfield for old Lard.
And they did that in the summer. That was the summer industry.
Any more questions for Leona and Pete? And if let's see. Ellen wants to say that she has a package of rose spruce gum she found at an antique shop labeled as Nature's Chewing Gum, refined and put up by Rowe and Company, Woodland, Maine, and St. Stephen and NB, New Brunswick. Yeah,
Very nice.
cool. Well,
Yeah, I read that those boxes are collectibles now. Anybody that has them, hold on to them. It might be worth something.
save it, Ellen. You can retire. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, especially thank you to Peter and Leona and Jackie. Jackie's behind the scenes, but thank you very much for your time tonight and for sharing these treasured memories. It's great when it all comes together like this, when it's a loved one and it's educational, it's fun, and it just brings back a whole era that, probably none of us can really imagine. So thank you very much. We'll have this recorded and we'll have it on our website very soon. And look forward to seeing you all again in February. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks
Bye.
for tuning in. I'll hear you in February.
Oh, and Jackie promises to serenade us with some fiddle music.
Okay.
All right.